A clause is a piece of language which conveys some information about something or someone. If I just say, the naughty boy's next door, that doesn't give you any information about anything. You're likely to respond, well, what about the naughty boys? In the same way, if I just say, broke the windscreen on my brother's car, that isn't a complete piece of information either. You're not likely to feel you understand what happened. You'll want to know who broke the windscreen. However, if I put the two together and I say, the naughty boys next door broke the windscreen on my brother's car, that does give you a complete piece of information. Once I've said that, you may know something that you didn't know before. This is a clause. A clause is made up of two parts, a subject and a predicate. The subject is what the clause is about, the naughty boys next door. The predicate tells you something about the subject. In this case, it tells you what the subject did, broke the windscreen on my brother's car. Here are some more examples of how clauses are made up of a subject and a predicate. The small fluffy kitten slept in the basket. The small fluffy kitten is the thing we're giving some information about. It's the subject. Slept in the basket is what we're told about the small fluffy kitten. It's the predicate. I like ice cream. I is the subject, what the clause is about. Like ice cream is the thing we're being told about the subject, so it's the predicate. Kittens purr. Kittens is what the clause is about, it's the subject. Purr is what we're being told about the subject, so it's the predicate. The subject of a clause is always a noun phrase, and the predicate is always a verb phrase. So we can say that a clause is always made up of a noun phrase and a verb phrase. Subject and predicate are functions in the clause. They're jobs that need doing in order for the clause to be complete. These jobs have to be done by particular types of phrases. We talked earlier about the difference between what a phrase is and what it does. The difference between being a drinking bottle and being used as a watering can. Being a subject or a predicate is something that a phrase does in the context of a particular clause. And doing this job doesn't change what kind of phrase it is. The job of being the subject of a clause has to be done by a noun phrase, and the job of being the predicate of a clause has to be done by a verb phrase. Look again at the clause, the naughty boys next door broke the windscreen on my brother's car. The naughty boys next door is a noun phrase. We know this because the head of the phrase is boys, and boys is a noun. In this particular clause, this noun phrase is doing the job of being the subject. But it would still be a noun phrase if we took it out of this clause and put it somewhere else. For example, following a preposition in a prepositional phrase, as in, I yelled at the naughty boys next door. The naughty boys next door is still a noun phrase because its head is still a noun. But it's not a subject anymore if we take it out of the clause because it has to be a subject of something. It's only a subject if it's doing that particular job in a clause. In this case here, it's doing another job. It's being the post modifier in a prepositional phrase. In the same way, a verb phrase is always a verb phrase, because what makes it a verb phrase is that its head is a verb. So, broke the windscreen on my brother's car is a verb phrase because its head is broke, and broke is a verb. But it's only a predicate when it's being used to build a clause together with a subject. It has to be the predicate of something. So in the clause, the naughty boys next door broke the windscreen on my brother's car, the noun phrase, the naughty boys next door, is functioning as the subject of the clause, and the verb phrase, broke the windscreen on my brother's car, is functioning as the predicate of the clause. In English, the subject of a clause nearly always comes before the predicate. So usually, once you've found the subject of the clause, everything that comes after it is going to be the predicate. So in the sentence, this sentence has a subject and the predicate. The subject is this sentence, and the rest of it's the predicate. I took a good look at the man who had suddenly turned up on my doorstep. I is the subject. All the rest is the predicate. The giraffes who had spent the whole day foraging for leaves slept. The subject is the giraffes who had spent the whole day foraging for leaves, and the predicate is the last bit, slept. So normally, the subject comes first and the predicate is the rest of the clause. But there are exceptions to this. And one exception that you're likely to come across is sentences that quote direct speech, like this one. Steve said, "I don't like aardvarks." In this sentence, the subject, Steve, comes first. So we can do what we did with the other examples. We identify the subject and we say that the rest of the clause is the predicate. But in sentences like this one, you often get a different order of the elements, like this. "I don't like aardvarks," said Steve. Now, it's important to remember that it's not the position in the sentence that makes something a subject or a predicate. It's the job that it's doing in the sentence. Steve is still the thing that the rest of the sentence tells us something about here. So Steve is still the subject, even though he's not in the first position of the clause, but at the end. In addition to a subject and predicate, there's a third function that can sometimes appear in a clause. This function is called adverbial. An adverbial element tells you when or where or how or why the event of the clause happens. Adverbials are different from subjects and predicates because they're not obligatory in the clause. We could leave them out and the clause would still make sense. Here's some examples of adverbials. After dinner, we went to a movie. After dinner tells us when the going to a movie happened. At the local market, they sell fresh vegetables. At the local market is telling us where the selling fresh vegetables is happening. Slowly, he started to realize what was going on. Slowly is telling us how the realizing happened. Because of the rain, we couldn't go swimming. Because of the rain is telling us why we couldn't go swimming. Adverbial is a function, and it can be filled by a number of different kinds of things. If the adverbial function, so the job of saying when or where or how or why, if that function is filled by a single word, we call that word an adverb. So in suddenly, the elephants continued on their way. Suddenly is an adverb because it's a single word doing the adverbial job. But the same function can be filled by a prepositional phrase. In the morning, the elephants continued on their way. Or a noun phrase. The next day, the elephants continued on their way. Or even another clause. When they had eaten, the elephants continued on their way. A clause which is filling a function inside another clause, like this, is called a subordinate clause. We'll look at subordinate clauses in more detail later in the course. The important thing to notice here is that all of these different elements, an adverb, a prepositional phrase, a noun phrase, and a clause, they're all doing the same job here. They're telling you when the event happened. So they're doing the job of being adverbials. We've already looked at the different types of main verb in the lectures on verbs and verb phrases. Now that we've moved up to the level of the clause, we need to look at those different verb types again so that we can see how the predicate, the verb phrase, can have a different structure depending on the type of main verb. Remember that, as with all phrases, the only obligatory component of a verb phrase is the head, and the head of a verb phrase is the main verb. If the main verb is an intransitive verb, then it's possible for the verb to appear on its own in the verb phrase without needing anything to following it. So in this example, lions roar, the predicate is made up of just the intransitive verb roar. In the next example, the little boy who had fallen and scraped his knee cried. The predicate is just the intransitive verb cried, which tells us what the subject, the little boy who had fallen and scraped his knee, did. We can have post modifiers following an intransitive verb, but they don't have to be there. The clause still makes sense if we leave them out. So for example, we can say lions roar loudly with the adverb loudly post-modifying roar inside the verb phrase, or the little boy who had fallen and scraped his knee cried for his mother with the prepositional phrase for his mother post-modifying cried inside the verb phrase. But as we saw before, these sentences would still make sense if we didn't have the adverb loudly or the prepositional phrase for his mother filling the post-modifier slot. These post-modifiers can be there if we want to specify that extra information, but they're not necessary for the clause to be complete. Some verbs can't make up a predicate on their own. They need to be followed by a noun phrase. For example, the boy smashed is not a complete clause, even though it has the subject noun phrase, the boys, and a main verb, smashed. And this is because the verb smash really needs something following it. It needs a noun phrase that tells us what it was that the boy smashed. A verb that has to have a noun phrase following it in order to make a complete clause is called a transitive verb, and the noun phrase that follows the transitive verb inside the verb phrase is called the object of the clause. So in this clause here, the boys smashed the bottle, the noun phrase the bottle is functioning as the object of the verb. The last type of main verb that we can have in the predicate is a copula. A copula verb can't make up a predicate on its own either. We can't just say Kim is. So a copula verb also has to be followed by something more, but the thing that follows a copula isn't called an object, it's called a complement. And this is because objects are always noun phrases, but complements can be different kinds of things. They can be a noun phrase, as in Kim is a doctor, where is the copula verb, a doctor is the complement noun phrase. They can be adjective phrases, as in Kim is very kind, is again the copula verb, very kind is the complement. Or they can be prepositional phrases, as in Kim is in her office, is again a copula, in her office, the prepositional phrase is the complement here. To summarize, we've said that a clause is a piece of language which gives a piece of information about something or someone. There are two parts to a clause, the subject, which is always a noun phrase, and the predicate, which is always a verb phrase. In addition, a clause can have one or more adverbials, which tell you when, where, how, or why the event in the clause happens. In the next part, we're going to look at different types of clauses. Make sure you have a good understanding of the basic parts of a clause before you move on.